Hey everyone, I'm Liz and I'm going to show you how I made this Olaf doll from Frozen. Some things that you're going to need for this tutorial are a crochet hook. I'm using a size E, a pair of scissors to cut off your yarn, a needle to sew in your ends. You're going to need some craft wire if you want to make the arms posable, but you don't have to do that. You could just use yarn instead. And you're going to need some yarn. I used white yarn for most of the body. For the arms, I used this brown yarn. I used black for the buttons and also the tops of the eyes. For the bottoms of the eyes, I used charcoal gray. For the nose, I used this carrot orange. And I used this blue for the inside of the mouth. You're also going to need something to stuff the piece. I used this acrylic fiber fill for the majority of the body. I used some fiber fill, and I also used a little bit of split peas to put into the feet, just so that they're a little heavier than the rest of the body. So the first thing I'm going to do is to make a magic circle. I'm going to wrap my yarn around my fingers twice, and then I'm going to take that in my other hand. And I'm going to take my hook and I'm going to pull up a loop through those two loops. And now I'm going to chain one. And now I'm going to chain another one, and that's going to count as my first stitch. And now I'm going to do 5 more single crochets into both of my loops. Okay, and now I have my total of 6 stitches, and I'm going to close my magic circle. So I'm going to pull on the tail a little bit, and then I'm going to have 2 loops. One is going to be slightly smaller, and one is going to be slightly larger. I'm going to take the smaller of the loops from the side closest to the tail. I'm going to take that side of the loop, and I'm going to pull it until the other loop closes completely. And now that that loop is closed, I'm going to pull on the tail a little bit so that I can close this other one. And now I have my magic circle. So now I'm going to do the first row after my magic circle. I'm going to go into that first stitch that I made. I'm also going to take my tail along as I go, and I'm going to hide it so that I don't have to sew it in later. And I'm going to single crochet. And then I'm going to use a bobby pin to mark that stitch as the first stitch of my row. And now in this row, I'm going to increase every stitch. So I'm going to go back into the same stitch that I just did, and then I'm going to do another stitch to increase. And I'm going to do that all the way around the row. I'm going to go into the next stitch and do another increase. So I'm going to single crochet once, back into the same stitch, I'm going to single crochet again. And I'm going to do that in every stitch until I get back to my stitch marker. So I have gotten back to my stitch marker. I'm going to remove it, and I'm going to do the first stitch of my next row. And then I'm going to replace my stitch marker. And now in this row, I'm going to increase every second stitch. So into the next stitch, I'm going to do an increase. So I've done one single crochet, and now I'm going to go into the same stitch and do a second single crochet. And now I'm going to do that in every second stitch all the way around. So the first one I'm not going to increase, and the second one I'm going to increase. And I'm going to continue doing that until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten back to my stitch marker. I'm going to remove it again and do my first stitch of the row. And now I'm going to replace my stitch marker. And then I'm going to, in this row, increase every third stitch. So I'm going to go into the next stitch and do one, and then the third stitch I'm going to increase. So I'm going to pull up another loop and do another single crochet in the same stitch. And I'm going to do that in every third stitch all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten back to my stitch marker. I'm going to remove it again and do the first stitch of my next row. And replace my stitch marker. And in this row, I'm going to increase every fourth stitch. So I'm going to go on for a couple more stitches until I get to the fourth. And then I'm going to increase. And now I'm going to do that in every fourth stitch all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten back to my stitch marker again. I'm going to remove it and do the first stitch of my row. And now I'm going to replace my stitch marker. And now in this row, I'm going to increase every fifth stitch. So I'm going to continue until I get to the fifth stitch. And in that fifth stitch, I'm going to do an increase. So I'm going to go into the same stitch and do another single crochet. And then I'm going to do that in every fifth stitch all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten back to my stitch marker. I'm going to remove it. And I'm going to do the first stitch of my row. And then I'm going to put my stitch marker back. And for this row, I'm going to stop increasing. So I'm going to do another 5 rows without adding any more increases. So I've gotten to the end of 5 rows without increasing, so I'm going to remove my stitch marker. And then I'm going to do the first stitch of my next row. And then I'm going to put my stitch marker back. And now in this row, I'm going to be decreasing every 5th stitch. So I'm going to continue until I get to the 5th stitch, and then I'm going to do a decrease. So now the next stitch is going to be the 5th stitch, so I'm going to do a decrease. I'm going to pull up a loop, and then pull up a loop in the next stitch. And then I'm going to crochet all of those loops together. And I'm going to do that every 5th stitch, so I'm going to go ahead and continue doing a decrease every 5th stitch until I get to my stitch marker. So I've gotten to my stitch marker. I've finished doing my last decrease of the row, so I'm going to remove my stitch marker. And I'm going to do my first stitch of the row and replace my stitch marker. And now in this row, I'm going to decrease every 4th stitch. So I've already done the 1st stitch, and there's the 2nd, and there's the 3rd. And now in the 4th stitch, I'm going to pull up a loop and pull up a loop in the next and crochet together. So now I'm just going to continue doing that all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker, decreasing every 4th stitch. So I have done the last decrease of my row, and now I'm going to remove my stitch marker and do the 1st stitch of my row, and then I'm going to put back my stitch marker. And now in this row, I'm going to decrease every 3rd stitch. So here's the 2nd, and now the 3rd stitch I'm going to decrease. So I'm going to pull up a loop in the next, and crochet together. And now I'm going to continue doing that all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I have gotten back to my stitch marker, and now I'm going to remove it and do my next row. And now in this row, I'm going to decrease every 2nd stitch. So I'm going to pull up a loop in the next stitch and pull up a loop in the next one and decrease that 2nd stitch. And I'm going to do that every 2nd stitch all the way around. So into the next one, I'm just going to do 1 stitch. And then the next one I'm going to decrease. So I'm going to pull up a loop in those 2 and crochet together. And I'm going to do that until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten to the end of my row, and I've pulled open my loop so that I can stuff the bottom of the piece. So I have some acrylic fiber fill here. I'm just going to insert some acrylic fiber fill into the bottom of the piece. And I'm going to make sure that I add a lot of fiber fill so that this part of the piece will be stuffed pretty heavily, so that the bottom of the piece will be a little bit more heavy than the rest. So I've finished stuffing this bottom part, and now I'm going to continue with my next row. So I'm going to remove my stitch marker and do the 1st stitch of my next row. And I'm going to be careful not to pull up any of that fiber fill. I'm going to replace my stitch marker. And now in this row, I'm going to increase every 2nd stitch. So I'm going to go into the 2nd stitch and single crochet once, and then I'm going to go back into that same stitch and single crochet again. And I'm going to do that in every 2nd stitch all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. And now I've gotten back to my stitch marker, I'm going to remove it and do the 1st stitch of my row. And then I'm going to replace my stitch marker. And now in this row, I'm going to increase every 3rd stitch. So I've already done the 1st, and here's the 2nd. And now in the 3rd stitch, I'm going to single crochet twice for my increase. And I'm going to continue to single crochet twice in every 3rd stitch all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten back to my stitch marker, and now I'm going to remove it and do the 1st stitch of my row. And then I'm going to put that stitch marker back. And now in this row, I'm going to increase every 4th stitch. So on that 4th stitch, I'm going to do 2 single crochets in the same stitch. And I'm going to continue doing that every 4th stitch all the way around until I get back to my stitch marker. So I've gotten back to my stitch marker. I'm going to remove it and do the next row. I'm going to do my first stitch and then replace my stitch marker. And for this row, I'm going to stop increasing. So I'm going to do another 4 rows without increasing. And I'm going to continue to mark every stitch every time that I finish a row. So I'm just going to continue on for 4 more rows. So I have gotten to the end of 4 rows of single crochet without any more increases. So I'm going to pull open my loop, and now I'm going to use this wire to make the arms. Now I've cut a 16-inch piece of craft wire, and I'm going to use that to make my arms. You could use a pipe cleaner if you want, or you could also chain some brown yarn to do that, to do the foundation, but I'm going to be using a wire so that I can have the arms be bendable. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bend it down each end of the wire so that I can keep from poking myself with the wire tips. And then I'm going to measure 4 inches on each side of the wire, and then I'm just going to fold down those 4 inches toward the middle of the wire. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now that I have my wire folded, I'm going to use my yarn to make the rest of my arms. So I'm going to do a slip knot, and I'm going to put that slip knot onto the middle of my wire. Now, if you wanted to just use yarn, then you would just make sure to do a chain that was that had 16 loops on each side. So you'd want to have 32 in total, plus 1 on each end. But I'm just going to use this wire, and I'm going to single crochet onto the wire, directly onto the wire. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to chain up from my slip knot, and I'm going to try to keep that slip knot in the middle of the wire. And now that chain is going to count as my first stitch, so I'm going to pull up a loop around the wire and single crochet once. And now I'm going to single crochet 14 more times so that I have a total of 16 stitches on this side of the wire. And if you wanted to use yarn instead of a wire and not have the arms be posable, then you just make sure to have 16 chains plus 1 on each side so that you can do the 16 single crochets on each side of the wire. And now I'm going to use the end of the loop of the wire to do 5 single crochets inside of the loop. If you were just using yarn, then this would be your 17th loop on each side. So I just want to go into that loop and single crochet 5 times. Okay, and now I have all of my single crochets on the loop at the end of the wire. So now I'm going to single crochet on the opposite side of the wire. And I'm going to use the loops that I just made when I was single crocheting on the other side. So I'm just going to go into that loop, and I'm going to pull up a loop around the wire through that loop. And then I'm going to single crochet, and I'm going to do that in every set of loops that I just made until I get back to the middle of the wire. So I'm going to go into that next set of loops, pull up a loop around the wire, and single crochet. And now if you were just using yarn, then you would just single crochet onto the other side of the chain. So I've gotten to the middle of the wire, so now I'm just going to do the same thing on the other side. And again, if you were using yarn, this is where you would start to single crochet on the other side of your foundation chain. So I'm going to single crochet around this side of the wire now, and I'm going to do 16 more stitches. So I've gotten to the end of my 16 stitches. Now I'm going to do my 5 more stitches into that loop, just like I did on the other side. And now I've finished with those 5 single crochets. So now just like I did on the opposite side, I'm going to go into the loops at the bottom that I just made from my single crochets, go around the wire, pull up a loop, and single crochet. And I'm going to go into every loop. So now I've gotten back to the middle of the piece, so I'm just going to go into the next stitch and do a slip stitch. And then I'm going to cut off a long tail, and I'm going to use that tail to sew both sides together to give it a more rounded shape. So I've threaded my tail on my needle, and now I'm going to sew this piece together. I'm going to go into the top stitch, and then I'm going to go into the bottom stitch. And then I'm just going to pull that tight. And now I'm going to once again go into the top. And then go into the bottom. And pull it tight. And I'm going to continue doing this until I get to the end of the arm, so that the piece will have a lot more of a rounded shape. Okay, so I've gotten to the end of the arm, and as you can see, one side is a lot more rounded than the other, and the other is a lot more flat. So now that I have gotten to the end of the arm, I'm going to sew closed that little hole from the loop that we did our 5 single crochets off of. As you can see, there is a very visible hole right there. So I'm going to sew that closed. So I've finished sewing closed the arm, and now I'm going to go down to toward the middle so that I can do the other side. So I'm just going to insert my needle into the arm, and I'm going to sew downward until I get back to the middle of the piece so that I can sew closed the other side of the arm. So as you can see, I've sewn the other side. I've done that just by doing the exact same thing that I did on the other side toward the end, and I've also sewn closed the hole at the end of the arm. So now I just need to sew in the end of my yarn so that I can cut it away, and then the arms will be finished for now, and then I can add them to the rest of the body. So I'm going to add the arms now to the rest of the body. I'm going to take some scrap yarn, and I'm going to use that to mark the spot on my piece where I want the arms to go. So I'm going to line up these arms, and I'm going to mark the stitch underneath them. I'm going to insert my hook through one side, and I'm going to pull a piece of scrap yarn through. Then I'm going to line it up again, and I'm going to pull the scrap yarn through the side on the opposite side where I want the other arm to go through. Now I'm going to remove my stitch marker, and I'm going to do my next row. So I'm going to do the first stitch of the row, and then I'm going to put my stitch marker back, and then I'm going to continue. And once I get to that marked stitch, I'm going to insert the arm. Okay, now I've gotten to that marked stitch. I'm going to pull out my stitch marker so that I can insert the arm. And also I don't need it to be there anymore because I know where my stitch is. So I'm going to insert one side of the arms. And then I'm going to pull up a loop in that stitch that I marked. And I'm going to pull it up around the arms. So I'm going to go into that stitch, pull up my loop around the arm, and pull it up, and I'm going to make sure to pull it tight. I'm going to adjust it to be about the length that I want it to be so that it's about even on both sides. And then I'm just going to single crochet around that arm. And now I'm going to continue to single crochet until I get to the marked stitch on the other side so that I can do the other arm. So I've gotten to my marked stitch on the other side, so I'm going to remove the stitch marker. And then I'm going to place those arms just above where my marked stitch is. And then I'm going to pull up a loop around the arms in that marked stitch. I'm going to pull it tight. And then I'm just going to single crochet around the arms. And now I'm going to continue to single crochet until I get back to my stitch marker. So I have returned to my stitch marker, and now I'm going to pull open my loop, and before I continue any further, I'm going to add some more fiber fill to this side of the piece.